And welcome to Viewpoint. We're joined by Yaryna Klyuchkovska, an expert in communications and a consultant to the Ukrainian government. Yaryna, many thanks for joining us.
Hello.
Crisis of communication in the Ukrainian government. Is that true? Is it fair to say that?
It's not a fresh thing. It's been going on for years. It's just now the public is no longer satisfied with how the government is communicating. It used to be just a formal thing, you know, getting out press releases on the achievements on the government, making polish on top of stuff, making it look good. Now, after Maidan, people have a different expectation. They want to understand what's going on,
yes.
And the government can hardly keep up with that demand for information.
So, I mean, the demands after the Maidan, so this was in 2014, we had thousands, hundreds of thousands of people on the streets. Essentially, that was about, they wanted transparency. They wanted to know what was going on, where was their money going, who was controlling power. And that's continued over the last 18 months. These demands, they haven't gone away. Is that right?
Absolutely. And the government frequently confuses transparency with just dumping a lot of information on people.
Okay.
And they can't make nor heads nor tails out of it.
No. So what do you need to give to the people? How do you present this information? Because, I mean, the Ukrainian government has made some progress in the last 18 months. Is that true? But how do they get that across to the voters, to the people?
That's part of the issue, actually, thinking of people as just the voters and trying to think of all the communications as political communications. But in addition to the political function of the government, there is the state-building function of the government, which is not political, it's long-term. And with the average life of a minister about 11 months, it's really hard to think long-term, and that's what the government needs to do. We're looking forward to the reform of the public service, which should fix some of these things. And then the demand for proper communication inside the government can also focus on longer-term communicating policies, not just trying to get people looking good. So also, there's a dialogue.
So this is within government departments, you mean, or within the government and the bureaucracy?
And the bureaucracy and the public as well. Because right now you have the two layers of the communications in the government. You have the sort of old guard, the bureaucratic communicators. They're just churn out press releases about everything that's happening, any kind of meeting or agreement signed.
And we haven't seen a lot of reform in that area since Maidan.
Not yet.
No.
There are several donor-funded groups that are looking at that and trying to build out a plan of how to transform the government communication. But also there's this political layer on top, people who come in with ministers and then eventually leave with the ministers. And those two parts don't really work well with each other. No. So that's the thing, there's no continuity. But also a lot of people think of communication as sort of getting information out to the public. Very little time and effort is spent on building a dialogue, so hearing the people as well. It has to be a two-way street.
Absolutely. Why is communication so crucial? I mean, presumably this is about building democracy. But what is it about communication that is going to be important for Ukraine's long-term potential?
Eventually, you'll see that people want to be part of the conversation about how their country is being built and developed. And basically what happened on the Maidan was a failure to listen. The government failed to listen to the demand of the people, and you ended up with violence on the street. That's what happens when people are not heard. Like even in a family, when somebody's not heard, they get angry eventually. That's what's happening with the people. Democracy means that people need to not only understand, they also want to be part of it.
And so, I mean, so it's about being responsive to the demands of the people. And presumably elections are not enough, are they? I mean, that happens once every 3-4 years. We've just had local elections yesterday, discontent apparently running high. But people don't feel that just by casting a ballot that it's really satisfying, is it, their need for communication, to know what's going on? Absolutely.
And I think the fact that so little people showed up at the polls yesterday is a signal that they're again disappointed and frustrated in their attempts to being heard. They don't believe that the elections are going to change anything, because there's a lot of things that are happening beyond the elections. There are experts, and there are public interest groups, and there are NGOs. And these are valid channels of the public opinion being transferred through to the government to affect policies.
And are there enough of those institutions? Do you think civil society here is actually developed enough and is advanced enough to get through to the government and to communicate effectively the needs of the people? Do we need to see more in that sphere?
Yes, we do. There are some very good examples of how it's done, but what ends up happening They get frustrated, they can't get their point across, they end up in the opposition of the government, and then the government just shuts the door on them. It happens with the tax reform, for example. There were a lot of groups from the businesses, small and big alike, they wanted to affect how the tax reform, the new laws are being developed.
Yes.
At the end of the day, we have several competing views, no single one, and the basically NGOs feel that they have not been heard.
No.
They get upset, they start criticizing the government and to the dialogue. Our government needs to learn to take criticism constructively.
And are these NGOs and other smaller stakeholders, are they getting squeezed out? I mean, is the problem here does it come back to Ukraine's perennial problem of corruption and oligarchy? I mean, there are certain vested interests in the economy and in society who seem to control the conversation.
Absolutely, and every time those NGOs get shut out from the conversation, they suspect that there's some vested interests are trying to affect what's going on behind the closed doors. That's the thing the government needs to understand. Every time they close the door, people immediately suspect something untoward is happening behind those doors.
But it's not always the case.
Absolutely not. It's just so hard. The government is not used to this level of activism.
Yes.
There's so many voices competing for attention. There's so many viewpoints. It's hard to reconcile them. It's one of the reasons the reform takes such a long time. It's just hard to take into account everybody who has a point of view. So
this is something new for Ukraine. I mean.
And it's a healthy movement. It's a much healthier situation than with the previous government, when there was a nominal sort of dialogue going on that didn't affect anything, and the policy was all made by the select group of people.
Looking forward then, so do you see now in politics and society, there are actually reasons to be optimistic? Because at the moment, the mood, 18 months after Maidan, almost 2 years, it does seem rather downbeat. But do you believe that actually in the long term things are going in the right direction? I mean, what would you like to see so that we might improve the democracy, the civil society, the communication?
What I see is a normal change process. If you heard of the 5 stages of mourning, when people accept change, first there's denial, then there's bargaining, then there's anger.
And is that where we are now?
That's where we are now. We need to go through this anger stage, which will teach us to communicate more openly. It's a learning curve for everybody. It's a learning curve for the government. They need to learn to live in with this new level of expectation from the public, which is very high, unprecedentedly. And then we have to learn as a public, as an electorate, to learn to affect the policy in a constructive way beyond the polling booths.
And we need structures to do that, don't we? I mean,
Absolutely.
For example, is decentralization, is that one of these ways that the government is looking to increase responsiveness in communication? I mean, the bill on decentralization is due for a second reading now that we've had the local elections. It's not clear that it's going to get through, but would you, for example, you are a supporter of this, you hope it does because you think that would be better for communication and responsiveness. Is that true?
Decentralization is one of the good examples of a good initiative that has not been communicated properly. People do not understand why certain decisions have been made. Therefore, they always tend to suspect the worst. It's high time for the government and the President's administration to open a countrywide dialogue about decentralization. People need to understand why it's happening this way and not some other way. But you're completely right. It's much easier for people to organize on the local level and then affect the local government, which then, at the end of the day, decide how their taxpayers' money is spent. So this will be a good platform also for the local leaders to emerge and grow up to the national level, something that we sorely lack now. There's a lack of fresh blood in the politics.
All right, well, Yaryna Klyuchkovska, many thanks for joining us. We will be looking carefully at the situation going forward, and we'll hope for positive change.
Thank you.
You've been watching Viewpoint. I've been joined by Yaryna Klyuchkovska. She's an expert in communications and a consultant to the Ukrainian government. Join us again tomorrow for another edition. This is Ukraine Today.